full-length books that I ever read cover to cover was a literary adaptation of Batman No Man's Land. This was a Batman comic series about Gotham being besieged by a terrible earthquake and essentially cutting them off from the rest of the world. It was post-apocalyptic Batman, and it was very, very fun. I always liked post-apocalyptic stories. I was very fascinated by them. And the fact that we had Batman, my favorite superhero as a child, and pretty much still to today, starring in them, was super fun for me. In the midst of that book, we get introduced to a character, a young girl by the name of Cassandra Cain. And Cassandra Cain will go on to be one of my all-time favorite characters. After I finished reading this book, this inspires me to start reading comic books more seriously. I had always been a fan of Batman, and I had always been a fan of superheroes in general, but I had never really read comics up to this point. So I started getting very into comic books, and right as I start to read comics, an event happens that was monumental in my life, at least, if no one else's. The introduction of Stephanie Brown became Robin. Now, who is Stephanie Brown? She's Robin. I just told you that. Stephanie Brown was many things, but it was kind of a big story that there was going to be a female Robin. Made papers. People talked about it a lot. The normal, intelligent delegation of comic book fans freaked out about it. A girl Robin. But people were excited by it. I know I was kind of excited by it. And Stephanie Brown is a character that I quickly grew to like. So we've got these two things going on at the same time. We've got two kind of new, in my mind at least, young female characters that are kind of introduced. And both are kind of getting pumped up a little bit. The Stephanie Brown tenure as Robin is kind of a flop, not because people didn't like her, but because DC has to be DC. But Cassandra Cain gets her own comic book series. She was obviously popular right away, and people were interested in her as a character. Well, she has a kind of a hilariously dark, edgy backstory, one that comic books at the time would love to do. Cassandra Cain is the daughter of two of the world's greatest assassins, and DC's greatest assassins, David Cain, who has silver hair. That's the thing I always think about him. Has very cool silver hair. And Lady Shiva. And Cassandra Cain, she was taught not language, because David Cain didn't talk to her. She was taught to read body language and death. The part of the brain that was dedicated to language was now dedicated to violence and reading people and martial arts, making her the world's greatest martial artist. And all was going perfectly to plan until David Cain had her kill someone, and she saw the death and terror. The death and terror in the man's eyes. And she knew that she could never kill him, so she ran away. She lived on the street, and eventually Barbara Gordon found her, the Batgirl, the Oracle, and took her in. And thus she became the new Batgirl. But Cassandra Cain's kind of interesting backstory, it makes her notable in a few different ways. One of the most prominent, intellectually disabled characters in comics. And even though they eventually give her the ability to process language, she still has a lot of trouble speaking, and it makes it very hard for her to express things in words, and she often doesn't, preferring to fade into the background, as a bat would do. So Cassandra Cain fits very well within the Batman mythos, and she was an interesting enough character. She got her own series. Let me tell you about the Cassandra Cain series. There was a few notables about Cassandra Cain. One, she was mixed race, and two, she had learning disabilities. And these are the first two examples of a character like that getting her own series in comics. And comics struggles a lot sometimes with this concept, and it would be disingenuous to say it can't do this, and it would be disingenuous to say at the time there weren't series that were addressing these issues, but it was very rare then, and a little bit now, for a girl like that to lead her own series. And I need you to understand this. This was in a little bit of a way a risky prospect that DC was taking. Cassandra Cain was popular and she had heat on her, but would the somewhat unmovable comic book audiences really accept her as a character? It's hard for new characters to get ahead in the comic book world. Comic book people like their routines. They like reading the same characters over and over again. She was new. She was untested. It did gangbusters. It did incredibly well. This was an unmitigated success that DC had found itself. I think appropriately they had somehow lucked into a popular character, an extension of the Batcast. Heck, they even got points for progressiveness. So that's all well and good. And I love that comic book series. I love her solo run quite a lot. It is a very charming series. But at the same time, a second character kind of comes into development. That of Stephanie Brown. Stephanie Brown is, like Cassandra Cain, is the daughter of a villain, but not a really good villain in the sense that her dad was never successful as a supervillain. Her dad was the Clue Master, aka a total Riddler ripoff, who instead of providing riddles was lazier and just provided clues. Because riddles are hard to think of. So kind of her bit for a while, she would dress up as a character called the Spoiler, and just give away the clues. And Stephanie Brown is an interesting character in the Batmaniverse universe, Gothamverse, Bat Family, DC universe. In that she's a character that seems legitimately to enjoy being a superhero. And she had a sunny disposition and a fun design and was legitimately popular. She was a likable, cheerful character that contrasted well against the dark misery that was Gotham. And she was also appealing in the sense that she was a fun look at the lower tier crime world and a kind of a good bit of character development, because we often didn't get like development of it. Was interesting to see how a low-level supervillain family dealt with it. So even wrong to call Clue Master a supervillain, a villain or an ill, just a guy who wishes ill intent. But it was legitimately fun to see how like characters like this operated. And you know, Stephanie really, like, you get a sense of her as the equivalent of, you get a sense of her as the equivalent of one of these, of somebody who comes from screwed up backgrounds and situations and is still always striving to be better. And the fact that she is able to be cheerful and fun-loving and personality was nice. So these two characters premiere, and they premiere right around the time, or they kind of get big pushes, or right around the time I start getting into comics. So in a way, I've always felt connected to them. Like me and them are sort of interconnected within grand cosmos of the world. It's strange because I feel like these are my characters. Like these are characters like of my generation. The Cassandra Cain, the Batgirl, her comic series is doing pretty well. A momentous event happens, at least in my mind. There's a crossover with Stephanie Brown. Here's the thing. These two characters, one a bubbly personality who seems to like people and a drawn-in person who seems to have trouble connecting to people, shock the world. I don't know if they shock the world, but they surprisingly work great together. Like they're a perfect duo. They're the introvert and the extrovert who are friends. It was honestly incredibly charming to see. And Batman comics are many things. They are beautiful, they are poetic, they are gritty, they are tragic, but it's not charming usually. It was frankly kind of nice to see this character interaction in a Batman series. And the fact that they work so well as a duo, I always personally, on a personal note, and this is always on a personal note, I really like stories that are about charming characters who can successfully hang out with each other. I've always really been drawn to that. For some reason, new Hollywood movies have always appealed to me, like from the 70s and stuff. That's always been really charming to me because that's the total vibe. It's not so much about the story progression that is there, but it's about characters that exist that you are charmed to follow. I loved these characters. I don't know if that's clear. I have great and enormous affection for these two characters. They're probably in my top 10 favorite comic book characters of all time. I always kind of put them together because it's like, to me, they're like such an iconic duo that's hard for me to think of them outside of each other. So all this is happening. Stephanie Brown is in this huge hit as Cassandra Cain, but they're both really well liked. So you want to hear how DC ruins them? because DC would have to run them. See, DC Comics, Detective Comics, as a very obnoxious kid in my high school would insist on calling it. But all comics is run by runs on nostalgia. But I want to explain something to you. Comic books is the most status quo obsessed medium ever. Superhero comics will never ever break the status quo. People always say, well, I can't get into superhero comics because there's so much backstory. It's just impossible for me to understand. And I need you to understand something very simply. They will never, ever break the status quo. Ever in a million years. Maybe. I don't know. Modern comics seem to be trying, at least, to create new things, but who knows how long that will last. And they really love to pretend that they can. They really love to pretend that they have the ability to, and the status quo changes all the time, but they never do. And the thing about comics, you have to understand, it's all driven by no matter what developments happen, eventually a new team will come in and go well, this isn't how it was when I was a kid, so I'm just gonna change everything. And sometimes that's a good thing, and not so much. The DC brass decided that only Barbara Gordon could be Batgirl. Nobody else was allowed to be Batgirl. And the reason the sales were down was because Barbara Gordon was no longer Batgirl. And it had to be the way they grew up with, because that was the only good version of comics. And I need to feel like a child again because adult life is hard. And it's not fair. So if I can just make comics exactly like how I was a kid again, I'll get back to that. It ruined my childhood. Okay, so let's get into this. This makes me mad on a very legitimate level how shitty these characters will get treated. So Cassandra Cain is revealed to be a villain, has a heel turn, as wrestling fans would say. She becomes bad because something always bad. Remember how I said language was a big deal with her, and she had a lot of trouble processing it and reading it, and she wasn't super comfortable saying it all the time. No, out the window. Now she gets long villain speeches. Also, she can read Navajo, which is one of the most difficult languages ever, so that's good. Yeah, that was pretty unpopular, but it was also, that's just what they were going to do, and you don't get to say no to that. The other issue, so then what did they do to Stephanie? What did they do to Stephanie Brown? Well, they had Black Mask torture her to death in an overtly sexualized way. And what I mean overtly sexualized, I mean she was tortured to death, and the artist just really couldn't resist drawing her to be gyrating curvy the whole time, and that was charming. It was very, very charming. It was good. Good DC did that. People didn't like it, but it happened. Eventually they reversed it because everybody was really mad. And Cassandra Cain never regained the momentum she had because they kept writing her badly. Stephanie Brown got her own comic book series for a while, and that was really lovely and successful and great in so many ways. And that's one of my other favorite series. My ideal series, which would have been a dual book, didn't come until later, but we'll talk about that in a minute. It's really depressing that two very popular female characters that were well liked by the fan base got turned, essentially, their goal eventually became, by the way, the Stephanie Brown thing, with being Robin, if I didn't mention it, they reversed almost immediately. It was just really more of a device to give angst to the Robins, and that seemed to be DC's position on these characters, is that they should just be angst machines for the Robins. The boy Robins, the only ones that counted. And it is very depressing to see very popular female characters who had brought kind of a new light and energy into the series be just shat on so much. Hate it. Just hate it. I'm still mad about it to this day because it wasn't like what some old men read when they were kids. This made me not like older Batman comics for a while. This whole attitude of comics have to be like when they were in the Silver Age. They were good. Because it felt like we were ruining modern comics just to live the fantasies of a bunch of dudes. Comics are already sort of very fantastical, so. I have a theory, this is a personal little theory of mine, that every issue that DC Comics every controversy and issue in DC Comics can be traced back to 3 decisions. The Cassandra Cain and Stephanie Brown sidelining or two of them, and the replacement of Wally West, and the other one was bringing back Barry Allen as the Flash. I think literally every situation, every controversy that DC has gone through can be traced back to those decisions. I'll probably try and do something about Wally West eventually. Needless to say, the passion's always been burning for these characters, for Cain and Brown, and eventually the old management was kind of let go. And you want to, for what else? An entertainment executive. What else did you think they did? Covering up sexual misconduct, crime, assault, bad things. It's all. Whenever an executive fired, that's like 90% of the reason why. And Dan DiDio, the executive in question, I feel had a mixed history. But knowing that, screw him. Who cares? I have no interest in justifying him. So, there's good news. Cassandra Cain and Stephanie Brown have returned as characters. A new series was announced with Becky Coogan at the helm, and I liked it. I legitimately liked it. It's frustrating to read at times because I'm like, this should have been happening so much earlier. And I don't consider it necessarily a happy ending that we're just right at the place we should have been. Like, this should have happened pretty soon after these two characters, the chemistry between these two characters that they figured out. And, maybe there's a little bit of disappointment when I read it, when I go like, damn it, I wanted to write this series. They were with me when I started comic books and I wanted to be the one to introduce them. So the future, I feel, is looking bright. And, they're popular now because the generation that grew up with them, with Cain and Brown, are in charge. And I hope that these characters can stick finally, and they can get the mainstream appeal and push that they so deserve. But I've been burnt before, so who knows? I always try and be optimistic though, and I feel we will all walk in the sun again.